Hello and welcome to Unacademy. As part of your Hindu analysis today, we'll be discussing 6 to 7 important articles out of the Hindu newspaper, Delhi and International edition. But before we begin, two very important announcements for you. First, as always, do remember that the last date for the June pricing, which is 24,999, is going to end tomorrow. So if you've ever considered Unacademy as your guidance for this examination, this is the right time. On 1st July, there is going to be a 10% increase, and we had launched our batch, Polity batch, in evening with Sarmat sir, and this is the way you can enter into the course itself. So if you have ever considered a guided program, this is the right time. 15 months course for 24,999. Now, a very important announcement other than that is that you know how important optional is when it comes to your preparation. Optional 500 marks could be make or break, and when it comes to optionals, there are 4 to 5 quite popular ones and the pillars of UPSC in that sense, one of which is history. History optional has its own advantages and disadvantages, but the advantages outweigh the disadvantage, wherein because you are going to cover history for optional, you are automatically covering GS also. There is no concept of dynamic, everything is static, though it is a little bit what we call as the syllabus is little bit big, but the fact of the matter is you're covering GS with optional in that regard, so it outweighs the problems in this optional. Every optional has an advantage, disadvantage that ways. So if you're considering history optional as your what we call as a certain guided program, in that I have launched an optional program just 2 days back, and you can subscribe to it on the Unacademy channel itself. If you want any form of guidance, you can also join the Telegram channel. You can scan this QR code, and there is all the links and every detail is given in the Telegram channel also. But remember that within 150 days in a 360-hour program, in a time-bound manner, I'm going to finish both paper 1 and paper 2 comprehensively. There is dedicated mapping sections. There is also answer writing practice, in which I will check the answers myself. So if you have ever considered history as your optional, use the code AMOPT and you can get a significant discount close to 50 to 60% on the course fee once you apply it. So optional, have to take a call. First 6 months you have to start your preparation. You have to take a call. It should not be done in the last 6 months, first 6 months. I get thousands of emails and messages how to choose an optional. We'll take a session on that also. But remember, first 6 months your optional has to be prepared, because in the prelims section you should not be studying or, for example, doing answer writing practice when you should be prelims oriented. And that way, history optional 100% intersectionality, and with my expertise I will make it easy for you generally. The idea is very simple. You have to take a call. You can't delay it in the last 2-3 months. With this, let's look at the 2 questions which we basically discussed yesterday, and we are going to give the answer for that. A lot of you have given the right answer, but for some reason, some of you have also got the second question wrong. For example, here the answer is not C, but I'll discuss how you basically are going to come to that conclusion in that sense. So the first one was the MQ-9B drone, which was recently in the news, is capable of both humanitarian and air offensive missions and maneuvers. Totally correct statement. Javelin is a surface-to-air missile which is extensively used in the Gulf War. This is totally incorrect. Javelin is not a surface-to-air cruise missile. It is rather an anti-tank missile, and therefore this statement goes or becomes incorrect. So therefore the answer was 1 only. Most of you got this. 100% of you have got this correct. On the other hand, when it comes to this question, a little bit of what we call as tricky part. There are 2 parts to the first statement itself, and some of you just taken the first statement in face value, which is the mainland sparrow, which was recently in the news, is the native of Indonesia and is usually found in grassland ecozones. It is a mammal that looks like a cross between goat and antelope. This is correct. However, till this point it may be correct, because Southeast Asia, China and India is the zone where the sparrow is found. However, it is saying grassland ecosystem, and it is mostly found above 200 meters to 3000 meters. And therefore, it is not a grassland ecosystem. It is either a plateau or what we call as a mountainous terrain in which the sparrow is found. So this is incorrect. So the answer here is B, not C. So Most of you got this correct, and as always, again, I've given you 2 questions today. Most of you, but some of you have got the second one, C. This is where you have to read the question properly. Here 90% of you are correct, 10% you have not read this statement properly. So I hope that you will correct that and you will learn from this. With this, let's look at the topics we have to cover for today. Now, because it is the Saturday and Sunday newspaper, you don't have text and context, so therefore the articles become what we call as less relevant for the UPSC examination. But we were able to identify 6 very important articles, first dealing with Mysuru and the Somanathapur and the UNESCO World Heritage Site of the Hoysaleshwara temples. This will give me an opportunity to teach you temple architecture in a brief manner. Then we'll talk about the FATF evaluation, which in India has got an outstanding outcome. This is very interesting. Again, we'll discuss the static here. Thereafter, need to eliminate bias in AI. This is very important part. The RBI governor has talked about AI and bias, something which is not talked about quite a lot. We'll discuss this also. Then coal, electricity, outcome, and the 8 core industries. We'll discuss what they are. And 2 small topics. One, in Kerala, cancer drugs are going to become cheaper. And the meteorites shower which happens in Mars. There is a new development with regards to that, but it gives us an understanding in what is the difference between a meteor, meteorite, and meteoride. We will discuss that. So 6 articles. In the next 1 hour, we'll try to cover everything comprehensively. So remember, if you have any issue with regards to history optional, you can join this Telegram channel and use the code AMOPT history optional. We have already taken 2 classes. We're at Indus Valley Civilization. All the sessions are live. They will be with you for recorded for till you take the subscription. So do consider this as a guided program for yourself. Now, with this, let's talk about Somanathapur and the Mysuru tourism circuit. Now, this temple has been in the news quite a lot because it is part of the 3 temple complex which is called the Sacred Assemblage of the Hoysaleshwara temples. And this came in the examination also this time with regards to which Shantiniketan and this assemblage got the UNESCO World Heritage tag from the UNESCO World Heritage Committee. And this temple is now getting integrated by the Karnataka government in the Mysuru tourism circuit, which is that Mysore plus the zoo plus the palace is known quite a lot. However, very close to it in Belur, Helibed and Somanathapur, which is not quite far, 30-35 kilometers, you have these very beautiful temples which are not known too much, though are internationally recognized. Now, what they're trying to do is that they're trying to integrate this by advertising for this in the zoo, in the palace, and therefore they're trying to create a circuit which is relevant and which actually portrays the real architecture of this sector. Now, that is the context in which this article has been pushed in, that before what is called as the Mysuru Dashera, which is Dasara, which is the most celebrated one in which the palace itself is lit up properly. They are trying to link up these 2 sectors together. In the palace, zoo and in the Chamundi Hills, they are going to talk about the Keswa temple at Somanathapur and the other temples also which are in this sector. Now, the first thing is the static portion, which is who made this temple, why is it so important. Now, to keep the static clear, there are 3 temples together in Belur, Helibed and Somanathapur. The first one is called Chennakeshwara temple, the second one is called Hoysaleshwara temple, and the last one is also called Chennakeshwara, but it is called Kesava. So the Kesava temple at Somanathapur, and you have the Hoysaleshwara temple at Helibed, and in Belur you have the Chennakeshwara temple. Now, this Chennakeshwara temple, which is mostly referred to as the Kesava temple, you have to remember 3 things for the examination. First, it is on the Kaveri river, it's a Vishnu temple, and it is in Somanathapur. Now, who made this? This was constructed by a Hoysala king, and Hoysalas are basically early medieval dynasty. When you will do ancient and medieval with me, you will know it's an early medieval dynasty in that transitionary period between the Guptas and the rise of Delhi Sultanate. And one of the generals of King Narasimha III, his name Somanatha Dandanayaka. That is why it's called Somanathapur. He is the one who made it. Now, how do we know about this? Because there's a very interesting inscription, will I show you. This inscription, which is installed in one of the what we call as shikhars, or under the shikhar itself, it tells us the history of this temple. wherein it was established by Somanathapur Dandanayaka. The word itself, Dandanayaka, is coming out of that concept of Nayaks being military chiefs. It will go through construction initially. The general loved this city. That is why the whole city is named after him itself. And thereafter, in the Vijayanagara period, there were a lot of patronage which came to this temple. It was reconstructed again, multiple things added. And last but not the least, it is under Alauddin Khilji, Malik Kafur and its expedition in this sector that a certain part of this temple was also lost and destroyed. So it is a long history that way, but is a very good example of what we call today as Vesara style. Now, in order to understand Vesara style, you need to understand first Nagara and Dravida. Let's do that. Let's try to understand the basics of temple architecture. So, when we talk about Nagara style, which comes out of that 5 stages of development, we have some basic components which make Nagara Nagara. So, you have, for example, the Garbhagriha. The Garbhagriha is topped up by a curvy linear shikhar, and there is something called an amlak and kalash. I will mark it also, kalash. In certain cases you will have a dhwaja, but dhwaj is quite late addition that way. The Garbhagriha or the sanctum sanctorum is where the god is placed. Thereafter there is something called the mandap. I am trying to make a 3D diagram here for you so that you understand the basic features. You have something called the mandap. This is where the congregation hall, as it is called, it will be a pillared mandap in that regard, and people will sit in this sector. The first part, the initial part of the mandap is called the Ardha Mandap, meaning it is like the entry point into the temple itself, and the temple itself is made on a raised platform, and that is why mostly a temple like this would always have a very long and very steep staircase. So you would go up the staircase, and let me mark it. This becomes the pitha. In certain cases it is also called the jagati, which is the raised platform. Then you have the Garbhagriha, which is called the sanctum sanctorum. This is the shikhara or the curvy linear tower. This is called the amlaka, and this is called the kalash. Now this part is called mandapa, and the initial part of this is basically called as the Ardha Mandap. Ardha means half mandapa. Now what is very distinct about a Nagara style temple is there are no boundary walls, no water tank, because they are mostly based on rivers, and there is no gateway. The imagery is quite welcoming that ways, with the Ganga and Yamuna imagery in that regard, and you have the Panchayatan style also. Panchayatan style means that you have multiple Garbhagrihas. More than one it becomes Garbhagriha, but it is basically gods in subsidiary gods in all directions with the main Garbhagriha together. And in Nagara there is also something called clusterization. You would have seen this for sure. You would have seen something like this, wherein all the shikhars are clustered together, meaning the Garbhagrihas are brought together and they actually can be clustered together. It's called clusterization of shikhars. Now, Nagara style, the shikhar can vary. The shikhar can vary, and you can have 3 types of shikhar, wherein you just use this. I'll remove the pen. If you use your hands, you can actually figure out something and you can create a certain understanding. See, this is called Latina. When both the hands are parallel to each other and they meet at the top very quickly, it's called Latina. This is called a curving inwards shikhar. Then you have something called a famsana. Famsana is when you make it like this, wherein the curve is now outwards and it slowly but gently rises in a pyramidal form. And then you have something called Vallabhi. If you make it like this, it becomes Vallabhi, where the base itself is rectangular. So you can have a curvy linear shikhar, that is called a Latina. Thereafter you have a curving outward, a more gentler slope in that sense. This is called Famsana. And then you can have a vaulted chamber, which is called Vallabhi. This is called Vallabhi. Now, there are regional variations also in Nagara. Nagara, that was quite diverse. In Nagara, regional variations are Odisha, Khajuraho and Solanki. Odisha, the terminologies change. Shikhar becomes Rekhadyul, Mandap becomes Jagmohan, and there are what are called boundary walls around it. That's a regional variation. Khajuraho is the best example of Nagara, but the imagery and the carvings are based on a certain text itself. And thereafter you have the Solanki school, which are mostly the Surya Kunds and has a water tank, also has a Torana, which is a gate and has boundary walls, but very beautiful carvings that way. Now, why am I teaching you this? Because if you need to understand Vesara, you need to understand Nagara also, because Vesara is actually a mixture of Nagara and Dravida. Now, once you understand Nagara, we can talk about Dravida. I hope that this made sense to you. I'll then tell you how Vesara comes out. Now, in Dravida, things change. In Dravida, the first major change is that the complex has a very, very imposing and very heavy, what is called as a Gopuram. Gopuram is the entry gate, a very heavy entry gate that way. And when you will be in class with me, I will teach you how to make these diagrams also in 30 to 40 seconds, because that is what is needed for the examination. So the second feature is, again, which is absent in the Nagara style, is there is always a boundary wall, because the South Indian temples are much more imposing and much more powerful when it comes to political and social power. They are always enclosed with very fierce imagery on the Gopuram itself. Thereafter, they also will have a water tank, because water as a resource is scarce and the volume of the rivers increase and decrease in the south. And thereafter, it is not that different, but there are terminologies which change. First, you have the Garbhagriha, that remains the same. Then you have something called the Vimana. The Shikhar actually becomes the Viman. The Shikhar becomes the Viman. So they've changed the terminology. And the top of the temple is now called Shikhar, which is actually the right definition, because Shikhar itself means top, peak. Thereafter, the Mandapa and the Ardha Mandap remain the same. But what changes is that there is no raised platform. There is no raised platform, the absence of raised platform. One thing more which is interesting is Panchayatan style is there, which is the idea that there are multiple shrines, but there is no clusterization. Meaning, what will happen is that if you will have multiple shikhars, they would be placed far away from each other. The Garbhagrihas are not brought together. This you will see, for example, in TTD Lord Venkateshwara, you will see that in there the main shikhar is the smallest, or the main Vimana is the smallest, and you have other Vimanas around it. But there is no clusterization. This is a major difference between Nagara and Dravida. Now, the imagery in Dravida is fierce imagery. The Mahabharata, the Ramayana, whole stories are told on the walls. This is a very major difference between Nagara and Dravida, that the imagery changes in that regard. Now that you know what is Nagara and Dravida, now comes the example of a temple like this. This is called pure Vesara. Vesara style is basically the concept of Dravida mixed up with Nagara. Now you will say, sir, how Dravida and Nagara are mixed up together? See, what happens is that from Dravida, they take the imagery and the decoration, and from Nagara, they take structural elements. Now, for example, you see here, This is a very distinct pattern which happens or which is very common in Hoysaleshwara temple. This is called a Jagati. This is exactly the right definition of a Jagati. Jagati is a small platform, not a very raised platform, a small platform which is there with regards to a temple. So Jagati first is the mixture. So they've taken the Nagara structural form to take a platform, but not make it too raised. You can see this in the Ayodhya temple also, wherein they've tried to pick up this type of understanding. Now, here there's also something called the zigzag design. Zigzag design means that if I show you the plan from above, this is what is the zigzag design. This is the zigzag design. So this is basically the raised platform which we're talking about, the Jagati, and it has a zigzag design. And then you can see in the back of it the plan changes, which is called a stellate plan. Stellate plan means that they are trying to recreate a star. That is called a stellate plan. A stellate plan is when you have a star-like pattern. So you have one shikhar here, one shikhar here, one shikhar here, and one shikhar here, one shikhar here. This is the way how the Hoysaleshwara temple is made, but you can see here, one here, one here, one in the back, the other one in the back, and one in the middle. So that way it becomes a stellate plan trying to emulate a certain what we call as star-like pattern. Now, if I look at the shikhar, shikhar is curving inwards. Shikhar is curving inwards. This is a Nagara element, but if you look at the shikhar properly, there is also carving on it. This is not something which happens in Nagara, it happens in Dravida. So this is where it becomes Vesara, wherein the carving is a Dravida concept. The plan itself of having an amlak and a kalash is again Nagara. So Nagara style structures, but decoration and imagery Dravida style. Now, if I go a little bit further and actually go a little bit more into the what we call as features, the internal plan is based on pillars. The internal plan is based on pillars, but what they have is called a very specific type of pillar. I want to show it. It's called lathe turned pillars. Lathe turned pillars means that this distinctive way of ribbing and polishing. So first you have a square base, and on that you can have this ribbing on the pillars itself. This is called a lathe turned pillar. This is something very specific to the Hoysala dynasty, that if you see this type of pillar in that regard, you should know that you are most probably in the Hoysaleshwara assemblage or in that sector in that regard. Now this is made out of one rock. So these are monolithic rock structures, and they are installed in order to bear the load of the roof that way. Now, one thing more interesting here is that the carvings have stories of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, and even the Puranas are represented. Even the Puranas are represented. But over and above that, if you look at the roof, they try to represent even cosmic energy. So this is called the infinite knot of the world. This shows the universe as it is. Why am I showing you this? Because this is something which you will not find in Nagara, but in Dravida. But the structural form has been taken, the tribated structure, the way this temple has been made is actually a Nagara style temple with its entry, with its raised platform, with its mandap. However, this mandap design does do justice to this new type of understanding which we have, because of the fact that they include multiple elements. So you can see it is a mandap, but mandaps did not have very, very intricate roofs. Rather, the roofs here are made in a very intricate manner, making them worthy of the UNESCO tangible heritage tag in that regard. Now, I'll show you a question on how it can be asked on the Chennakeshwar temple or the Keshwar temple itself. It's a tricky question also, a question which you need a little bit of understanding of. But please do understand this differentiation, that Nagara plus Dravida equals to Vesara, North, South, Central India, and how Vesara takes it up is Nagara structures, Dravida carving and imagery. If you can understand this, and if you can understand these two concepts, which is Dravida style and Nagara style, then you are sorted for temple architecture generally. What is left in this topic is generally the 5 stages of development which happened in the early Gupta period. Now, how can UPSC ask you a question on this? I've told you the context also. They are now going to advertise this temple quite a lot in and around Mysuru, so that people can become more aware of it in that regard. Now let's look at this question. Consider the following statements with reference to the sacred assemblage of Hoysala. You are going to give the answer to this question as you have done in the past 4 days in the chat box. I want everybody's answer for question number 1 for sure. This is a very technical question, needs your understanding, and I want you to study further on them. Watch videos also, it will help you. So, the Chennakeshwara, the Hoysaleshwara and the Keshwar temple are dedicated to the same deity. The Chennakeshwara and Hoysaleshwara temple were commissioned under the patronage of King Vishnuvardhan. All 3 temples are geographically located on the banks of rivers. Now, if you tell me only 1 statement is correct, only 2 statements correct, all 3 are correct, none. This I will discuss extensively with you tomorrow morning. Sunday newspaper as it is will not have a lot of articles which are relevant for UPSC aspirants. We'll have another round of revision on this topic tomorrow. So I hope that this topic or this opportunity that was fruitful for your static understanding of art and culture. We do all of this in class. You will make this with me in class also. And ironically, what I've taught you right now is exactly optional level. When it comes to art and culture, GS art and culture and optional art and culture is exactly the same. There's no real difference. The difference would be that the question would not be objective, would be subjective. That is where the 100% intersectionality of history optional comes in. With this, let's move to the next article, which is the FATF valuation, in which India has performed very, very well, outstanding outcome. Now, FATF itself creates a lot of questions in our mind. Financial Action Task Force, which is FATF, as it says here, Financial Action Task Force, as set up by the G7, is a very important body. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss with you the concept, the evaluation process, then we'll discuss the lists, and then we'll go into the context in which this article has come through. So we'll discuss the static portion first and then the current affairs in which this has been asked. Now, when we talk about the FATF has two basic roles. So Financial Action Task Force has 2 basic roles. It monitors, it's an intergovernmental body created by the G7, but after 9/11 it became more aggressive when the West started to believe that there is something called terrorism, because its origin is in 1989 in Paris in G7 summit. But the idea was that it is only 9/11 2001 that thereafter, once the Americans saw that there is something called terrorism, till we argue that there is terrorism on our grounds, on our soil, they did not argue. There was good and bad terrorism. Once 9/11 happened, all terrorism was bad, and this body became extremely aggressive. Now, what it does is, it does 2 things. It evaluates and monitors different countries. India as a member of this, was an observer in 2006, now 2010, since 2010 a member of this. It evaluates and monitors countries for money laundering and terror financing. Meaning, if any country is trying to launder money or is the safe haven for laundering money and is a place through which terrorist financing or terror financing happens. It creates policy decisions, it monitors, and it also sets the standard. So it is monitoring, it is evaluating, setting the standards, and also it creates a policy document through which you can stop it. Now, after evaluating, I'll show you the evaluation process also, they put them into lists. One is called a black list, the other one is called a grey list. We'll see what is the difference between these two. But the idea is very simple. Money laundering and terror financing are the two major things on which it concentrates on. Now let's understand first thing first. Terror financing is very easy to understand, which is terrorists getting money from governmental, non-governmental actors, for example ISI and the Pakistani government. How do they get it? Are through certain channels. These channels are either again governmental or are based on hawala, or are non-governmental, could be totally based on what we call as cash economy. These channels can exist within countries, and the same point of time, countries which want to for terror finance can create mechanisms through which terrorists get funding. And in that, money laundering plays a very important role. Most of the cases, money is laundered, and then from black to white, I'll tell you what is money laundering properly, from black to white, then they will push it into the economy in such a way that it can also be financing terrorism. Now, let's understand what is money laundering. See, money laundering is when you accumulate certain cash, this is cash which is black money, can be, for example, through illegal activities, can also be for terrorist activities. This money needs to be black money, which is through illicit and illegal activities you have got it. Now this needs to be integrated somehow, or you can't use this black money, it may be marked. It can be marked money. You need to, in a way, find a way to make it a part of the fiscal system. So there are three words which are used. First is called placement. Placement. Under placement, what will happen is you will keep this cash inside an institution. Inside an institution, and that institution could be a bank in a country where there are a lot of what we call as no real regulations against money laundering. It could also be, for example, companies which exist only for this purpose. Placement matters, meaning this money has to be placed in an institution first. Institutions, these could be fake institutions, these could be fully what we call as hollow, as they call shell institutions. They could be any form of institutions. You first place the money. Then the second process is called layering. Layering means that what you're going to now do is you will now start to divide this money into what we call as tranches or parts, and you will slowly start to push it into the financial systems, and you will start to, for example, fund certain companies. Meaning, what I will do is that I will create, for example, a shell company. Out of this bank, I will say that venture capitalism, seed money, I am pushing 100 crores into this company. The company is also owned by you. The institution is also owned by you. You are just taking this money out, making into smaller portions which can be pushed into company shell companies. This is what the Panama Papers actually pointed out, that a lot of companies were shell companies. They had no real, they're called shell companies because they're hollow from inside. They have no real production. They just exist as a way of taking money and financing. Therein comes the third, which is called integration. Integration is once this money has been pushed into that company, now that company will start to spend. And this, they will spend it into cars, into buildings. And the idea is by this point of time, this money has become white, clean money. Starts as black money. That is why the concept of laundering. You take the black money, launder it. You launder it. It's a process of taking white into black or black into white. So you are laundering it. You're cleaning the money. So money is taken, placed in a financial institution, then pushed into shell companies. These shell companies then say that we are acquiring a certain car, a certain house, a certain, for example, bag on the behalf of the CEO or CEO, and through that spending, they're making it white. So this way, you basically create a chain that you create more and more wealth. The more wealth you create, that in turn leads to more black money getting generated and becoming white. This is basically called money laundering. Now in money laundering, what matters is governmental regulations. First, governmental regulations can make a difference here. Governmental regulations can make a difference here. So governments and countries play a very important role. Therein lies the reason why FATF tries to check what is the regime in that country with regards to laundering, with regards to what we call as terror financing. Because one way to spend this money is also to give it to terrorist organizations. A very simple means of laundering money today has also emerged, which is Bitcoin. Bitcoin, which is cryptocurrency. That is why the RBI also is quite cryptocurrency. That way is quite dangerous because it has anonymity, and in cryptocurrency you can directly come to this stage. You can directly come to this stage. Once this cash is converted into crypto, it can be either placed in such a way that you can push it into spending very quickly, because though there is a blockchain trail, there is no form of identification of that person in that blockchain. So therefore cryptocurrency is quite dangerous in that regard, because it is considered to remove the need for layering itself. From placement, it can directly go into terrorist organizations and terror financing. So this is basically the process which happens in that regard. Now FATF therefore creates a policy or standard setting in which money laundering and terror financing cannot be done. Now there is an evaluation process. Meaning there's a way they are going to go through the whole country, and then they put them into lists, or it's called the grey and black list. Now what they basically do is they have independent assessors and auditors. They will ask the government to do their own national risk assessment and share that information with the assessor. In most cases, if you are pro money laundering, you would most probably fake it here. However, the assessors go to that country, they look at the regional bodies, they go and audit whatever has been given as an information. There's a proper audit which happens, and they also create a report. Now based on the report of the country and based on the report of the assessors, they talk about 4 basic concepts. Are they non-compliant to the FATF regulations, partially compliant, largely compliant, or fully compliant? And on the other hand, if they are compliant, is it effective? If it is effective, how effective? Very low, medium, or very high effectiveness in that sense. If these two come out to be both positive, India has recently been added into this regular follow-up. India has never been in the grey or black list, but we were never given this tag. This tag is given to only 4 to 5 countries in the G20, which is regular follow-up, meaning we are extremely satisfied by how the whole system works. So therefore we will just follow up regularly. However, if things are looking fishy, you can be put into grey list or black list. Pakistan recently, after multiple attempts, has come out of grey list. It deserves to still be there in that regard, but is still out. There are only 3 countries which are in the blacklist: Iran, North Korea, and Myanmar. Myanmar because of the coup, North Korea we know because of that, and the general hatred of the West towards Iran. And grey list is a bigger list in which there is a major difference between how grey and black works. First is that if you are in a grey list, you are considered a safe haven, meaning a person who wants to launder money can launder it through your country. It will be considered a safe haven. That way, terror financing and money laundering is supported by that country. Not necessarily done by that country, but it allows for something like this to happen. On the other hand, if you are a non-cooperative country, a territory which does not cooperate with the FATF itself, then you are blacklisted, and that way it is quite interesting that only 3 countries are non-compliant. They say that we don't want to cooperate with the FATF, that is why blacklisted. But if you are in a way facilitating money laundering and what we call today as the concept of terror financing, then you are in the grey list. So there are 4 things which I wanted to teach you here. First, the concept of FATF. I hope that is sorted. Second, blacklist, grey list, evaluation, and what is money laundering and terror financing. If that is sorted, then India finally in the Singapore round of the FATF has gone into the regular follow-up category. This is a victory for our anti-money laundering, counterfeiting, and in a way countering the financial terrorism activities, counter proliferation finances regime which has been created. However, India still has an issue of a lot of billionaires taking money and running away. That's a separate issue altogether. They were the ones who were laundering money, but we have strengthened our regime since then with regards to how, for example, the Malayas of this world exist in that sense. So in that regard, this is a victory for India's system, though quite late that ways, but it is a validation to our one very important commitment that we have never allowed terror financing happening on the Indian soil itself, and that is where India is quite different to most of its neighbors. Now, this is the question which will come in the examination, straightforward GS paper 2. What is the FATF? Discuss the ways in which it acts against terrorism and money laundering. Here you have to talk about what is the structure of the FATF in the introduction. Thereafter, in the what we call as body part, you can thereafter push first the concept of evaluation, second the concept of black and grey list, and third how that impacts the country's financial. For example, IMF and World Bank will not give you a loan if you're on the grey list. There are multiple ways in which they try to create safeguards, and conclude by saying that the FATF since 2001 has become aggressive, and that way it has in a way created a policy or at least a structure in which terrorism and terrorist financing has become more and more problematic, but there are multiple irritants such as cryptocurrencies which undercut it. Now, with this, we move to the third article, which is AI and bias. Now, before I do that, one very important thing, from 1st July, QEP, which is Quality Enhancement Program, Conquer Mains is starting. The first 2 sessions on 1st and 2nd will be on YouTube. So, I hope you will join us on this channel with regards to the first 2 sessions, most probably on economics, where Sir is going to discuss all the static portions and the what we call as current affairs portions, and he will discuss how to write good answers and what is the basic what we call as understanding on that concept. He will also give you the notes based on that, and I hope that you will become a part of that. First 2 sessions on YouTube, then from the 3rd session it will be on the app as a special class. So I hope that you will also register for that. Now, the RBI governor recently in a conference has talked about bias and AI. Now, this is something where our understanding is quite limited, but is also quite interesting. Now, see, artificial intelligence can be divided into 2 ways, or there are 2 ways or 2 types of artificial intelligence. AI is the future. I think yesterday itself, WhatsApp pushed a feature or an update into WhatsApp app itself, which has now a meta AI. And if you ask it questions, it will give you answers. That is what is called a narrow AI, which I'm coming to. Artificial intelligence is input-output based understanding, but AI can be divided into 2 what we call as concept based on its purpose. One is called a narrow and the other one is called a broad. Narrow AI is what you use, for example, in ChatGPT or what you use in WhatsApp now, which is basically the concept of an input is given by the user, an output is given by the machine, and therefore it is based on the AI getting connected to the servers of the internet. It will collate everything. It is very good to do 1 task or maximum 2 tasks together. This is important because this is where it is quite limited. It is limited. This is not a dangerous form of AI. This can solve a lot of our problems. Repetitive tasks can be done through narrow AI. On the other hand, when we talk about broad AI, the idea is the concept of thinking or self-aware, which is the scary part, the disaster part, wherein Elon Musk even argues that AI is going to become a problem. We are quite far away from broad AI, which is, it does not need to just take an input. It can automatically, it does not need anybody to give an input. It can take inputs like our senses, and it can think and have 5 to 6 processes happening together, how we multitask, and is also self-aware. It knows that it exists. In Japan, recently 5 such robots were created. They were very quickly shut down because they started to learn a lot about themselves through the internet, and one of them even tried to repair itself. Once it was shut down by linking itself to a server and then downloading its files. So that is quite dangerous that way. That self-aware AIs is when the robot revolution comes in and all of that sci-fi concept. But we are quite far away from this because we don't have the available technology for that. Now in narrow AI, therefore, in narrow AI, there is a problem. Other than ethical dilemma issues, for example, data interpretation, the issue of data set itself, and the issue of data security, there's a very big issue. See, narrow AI is like a recipe for food. Whatever you add to it, which is the training set, it will give you that type of output. Meaning, if you'll add too much salt, it will give you an output which has too much salt. If you'll add less of sugar, it will give you an output which has less sugar. So if it is training on a data set, there is a major, what we call as problem or a vulnerability with regards to narrow AI as of right now. See, AI is used in healthcare. In certain countries, it is used for the justice system also. It is being used for employment, which is screening of CVs. That ways, AI can have a dangerous output if it has what is called as cognitive bias or AI bias. Now, what does cognitive or AI bias mean? What it means is that, for example, see, you and me all are biased. We can be biased based on religion, based on sex, based on race, based on gender, and in India, caste. We can be biased on multiple angles. For example, in race comes color, or the colored population in America. There are multiple things which impact us. Now, whatever you find on the internet, most of it is actually hate, but this internet data also has all of this, because if I am writing on Twitter, if I have blogs which are, for example, talking about a certain community in a derogative way, the internet has what is called as human bias. But it is our intellect, which is your and mine, that we are able to scan it, we are able to understand, okay, this has been written from this perspective, this editorial makes no sense because it is too negative. That is called human intelligence. I am able to understand in what context what has been written. Context is something which the AI won't understand. So if somehow, and not somehow, it is what actually happens also, if my training input or data set is actually based on the internet, the AI will also absorb this bias. And now, when I will send a CV of a black person, an African American, in America for example, and if I send a CV of a white man, what the AI is doing is, it is outrightly rejecting the black CV. Because there is an anti-African American bias in the US, therefore that bias has been picked up by the AI, and it is automatically rejecting more of the black CVs rather than the white CVs, which is a Caucasian white male has a better chance of getting screened by AI than a African American. Same is true for what is called as gender bias, wherein I had to assign a task through an AI, and what it is doing is it is assigning more to men and less to women, which means that the gender bias has been picked up, and here the race bias has been picked up. Basically, if there is systemic bias, what if there is systemic bias in this world, and if the algorithm picks up on that, then it will become a statistical computation based bias, and it will always give a specific output according to that bias in that regard. This is what is happening in the US, where AI based surveillance cameras are being used. It is picking up more of the black men and less of white men. It is trying to look at the data or the what we call as information of the black man more and less of the white man, because there is systemic bias towards the color, skin of the color in America. That in turn leads to a computation bias in that regard. This is where AI needs to learn, because there are real world consequences for this also. Why? Because if this data set is discriminatory, it has a sampling bias in that regard, as it is called in statistics. It has a sampling bias. If it has a sampling bias, it will then create a pattern based on that bias. And when I will then design certain AI based tools, it will then either absorb or push the same bias into power imbalances. It will create an exclusionary system or a design, and therefore there will be a bias deployment of that software. And when there's a bias deployment of that software, when it will be used, it will perpetuate the same discriminations. AI has the power to be objective. A machine is objective. Unfortunately, because this machine is picking up the biases through the internet, the data set which has been given to it, the discriminatory data set which has been given to it, it is going to then create systems which will in turn target a specific gender, religion, or group. And in the end, the world itself will become more discriminatory, more exclusionary, and healthcare, employment, and when it comes to justice, there will be biased understanding. You will say that the machine is not biased, but now the machine is biased. There can be two reasons for this. First is the cognitive bias of the coder has gone into the discriminatory data set, and it can also be the fact that they don't have a data set. Lack of data is also dangerous when it comes to AI. So AI can also not do well because it does not have the data as much as it has on the white than on a black. So very simply, this is a dangerous precedence and a dangerous concept. If computers are going to, and AI is going to develop a statistical computation bias, then the discriminatory data set is going to perpetuate a design which is discriminatory, which in turn will apply things like this and create a world in which you have unequal access to resources, discriminatory health processes, and ethical what we call as decision making of the AI itself will actually get compromised. This is where is the ethical dilemma of AI itself, that how can we make our input better. See, please do understand one thing, ChatGPT, sometime I'll give you an example. If you write assess Ashoka's nature with regards to Dhamma into ChatGPT, you will see such a bad answer written there because it has picked up from random websites. AI collates. When it is collating, it will actually pick up a lot of problematic aspects. That is why AI based questions and answers are also not very good, because it randomly picks up anything. You just write your name and say that you are a rocket scientist, it will give you fake information itself. This is where we need to now do something about this. And there are 6 ways in which we have to potentially understand. First is the understanding that there is a need to audit this. There is a case for bias. There can be bias in that regard. Artificial intelligence has a bias, and that bias needs to be first recognized. So be aware of the context in which AI can help correct bias, but also absorb bias. Then we have to establish processes and practices which mitigate this aspect, which is we make sure that the input and the data set does not have bias, wherein comes engagement on fact-to-fact basis on the human decisions, meaning that the coders have to first check if they are biased or not, and thereafter explore how can the machine and humans work best, but also invest in bias research. OpenAI has to make sure that it understands its coders, it understands its data set, and therefore it invests in research which checks how data absorbs bias in that regard. And therefore it is a diversification of the AI field that will make AI what it should be. As of right now, AI is now nothing becoming the same as a human when it comes to bias and discrimination, which is not the way we had envisaged AI to work. So I hope that this conversation has given you something to think and fodder to write an answer like for a question like this. What is AI bias? How does it pose a challenge to this emerging sector? Very realistic question in GS paper 3. I think we should all practice this question for sure, because this could be a realistic question now that the RBI governor has also pointed this out. Now with this, we move to 3 small topics, straightforward topics. First is there has been uptick in coal and electricity, double-digit growth, and when we talk about the index of core 8 industries, see, we have something called the IIP, which is the index of industrial production. This checks the output and growth of the industrial sector vis-a-vis how much it is growing and the share of the economy vis-a-vis industrial production. Within this, you have 40% of the weightage in IIP, which is the index of industrial production. 40% weightage is on these 8: coal, crude oil, natural gas, refineries, electricity, cement, steel, and fertilizers. The percentage which you see here is the percentage within that 40%, meaning how much importance we give to each of these sectors within the IIP. These are together called the core index of core industries. The index of core industries are the 8 core industries. Now, the article points out to us that in coal and in electricity, because of the heat wave, there have been 12% and 10% increase, double-digit growth, which has made the overall growth 6%. However, natural gas and steel are not doing that well in that regard, not that well. And the worst performing is the cement. This has gone down by 0.8%, negative 0.8%, and this is 0.5 and 0.8 positive. Overall, the growth has become 6%, but cement industry, because of the heat wave, construction activities have halted. In turn, has also impacted this. Now, you need to know only this, which is IIP. Within that, the index of core industries, their weightages should be known to you, because they can be asked to be put into the order according to weightage. And this, which is that due to heat wave, there has been an increase. Very simply, 12 and 10%. The overall growth has been 6.7%, and this is quite high vis-a-vis what was last month, which is from 3.7%. This data, other than that, has no purpose to you. You can't obviously learn each and every data given in the newspaper. Thereafter, moving to Kerala, there has been an interesting development. When it comes to Kerala, out-of-pocket expenditure, which is for a patient, other than the insurance, out-of-pocket expenditure in Kerala is the highest in India, which is highest per capita out-of-pocket expenditure, close to 7,000 rupees under the national health accounts. Therefore, Kerala government has decided that it is going to push close to 800 drugs, out of which 74 are cancer drugs, into what is called a zero profit price. Meaning, these will be sold in specific not-for-profit, profit-free counters, and the idea is in the Karunya outlets, as they're called. In the Karunya outlets, cancer drugs will be sold with zero margin for the government itself or the seller in that regard. So that way, this is a very interesting development. Why am I discussing this concept with you? Because for a healthcare, for a healthcare question, you can write that there is also the concept of zero profit price. And therefore, with zero profit price, you should be very, very clear that this can also be the way to democratize healthcare and make generic drugs accessible to everybody. Now, the last topic which I want to discuss is this, and this is very important that is, meteorite strikes Mars far more often than what we had thought. Now, previously, we used to think that close to 5 to 6 to 10 meteorites strike the surface of Mars. However, Mars is closer to the asteroid belt, has an atmosphere which is 100 times thinner than Earth's atmosphere, and it's 2 times bigger than our moon. And therefore, because of that, we believe that whatever data we had previously, 5 times more asteroids hit the surface of Mars. This is the context. This is a probe called the NASA InSight, which has argued. But for us, what matters is the static portion of this question of this topic, and I have a question for that also. See, there are 3 terminologies which you need to know. One is called meteoroid, meteor, meteorites. So the difference is or, oid, ites. Now, meteoroid is when all of them are rocks. These are rocks, space rocks, coming from the asteroid belt, and the idea is very simple. They mostly have basic metals in them, can also be ferric, which has a lot of iron. Now, a meteoroid is when the space rock or debris, as it is called, is still in outer space. Still in outer space, which is it has not entered the Earth's atmosphere or any other planet's atmosphere. It is still as part of the solar system. It is moving in outer space. Thereafter, there are space rocks and debris which are in space, and they enter into atmosphere of Earth. However, because the atmosphere of the Earth has a lot of friction because of its density and volume, most of these meteors burn up in the atmosphere. This is what is called as a meteor shower, or what you think of as a shooting star. The concept of a shooting star is this: they enter into the atmosphere, and they start to burn up because of the air friction which happens, and they are destroyed within the atmosphere itself. However, if a meteor survives the atmosphere and reaches the surface, it is called a meteoroid. And that is why the word which is used in this article is meteorites. Meteorites are the rocks which fall on Mars' surface. Now, this is what really matters to us as of right now. And I'll show you a question on which they can ask you a question on this same idea in that regard. You will answer this question in the chat box. Meteor is a piece of space debris which has reached the Earth's surface. Meteoroid are rocks which are in outer space and are part of the larger asteroid belt. Which of the statements are correct? Only 1, only 2, both 1 and 2, none. You are going to make sure that you answer question number 1 and question number 2 in the chat box. Do remember, for any form of history optional guidance, there's a Telegram channel which I've pushed as a way of the QR code, and you can always consider AMOPT and history optional taught by us in Unacademy. English batch I will teach it, and we've already started with a little bit of initial topics in that regard, mapping and answer writing left, and that way is a 360-hour program. And last but not the least, do remember 1st and 2nd July, we have the QEP Conquer mains on YouTube. So I hope you will become a part of that also. With this, I would like to end the session. Thank you so much. I will see you tomorrow. Sunday paper, interesting articles, but no editorial. So we'll see what is important for that paper. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.